Welcome back, folks. This is your next recorded lecture for HI121. This is Blue Sun, Black Death, the 536 CE Dust Veil event, the Plague of Justinian, and the Decline of the Ancient World. So I'm being totally self-indulgent, and to start closing things off, I'm jumping us ahead to the 6th century CE. So we see two major natural catastrophes in Eurasia. Both of which have received much more attention over the last 10 or 15 years. Our question is, what impact did they have on European and Near Eastern society? Did they constitute a clear break between the antique and medieval worlds, as has been argued? Or is this just resorting to discussions of environmental determinism yet again? I want to set the stage first because it's important to understand the status of the Mediterranean world at the time that this all happened. So this means talking briefly about Justinian. So Justinian came to the throne as co-emperor with his uncle in 527. He likely ruled prior to that effectively, as Justin was elderly and had become senile, the uncle. Justinian had been his consul since 521. He was a religiously minded workaholic with a talent for picking the right people for the right job and the dream of reconquering the West. He survived some early difficulties that might have cost him his throne, and once he'd settled things with the Persians for a while, sent some of his trusted generals to retake different former Roman provinces in the West. First North Africa, then Spain, then Italy. Meanwhile, he's back home having the entire Roman legal code rewritten. Now, he benefited greatly from the work of his predecessor and the huge surplus that had been left behind. Early in his reign, he'd also made the decision that he'd rather work for the benefit of the working class provincials rather than the elite, and he reformed the taxation system and the bureaucracy, specifically to prevent abuses from the powerful. This is one of the reasons why he's nearly knocked off his throne. He makes very powerful enemies. Now, the wisdom of his Western adventures is something that historians still debate. Did he overextend himself? Well, not at the time. He had incredible amounts of money and manpower and was using them fairly wisely. Functionally speaking, he did overextend himself because once the plague hit, that manpower just wasn't there anymore. But before we talk about the plague, we need to talk about what happened in 536 CE. Because it was something unusual. We don't know for sure what it was. All we know is that many of our sources from the period talk about a mysterious dimming of the sun, most particularly in 536 and 537. Our fullest account is from Procopius, Justinian's court historian, and he talks about how the sun seemed to be in eclipse for the entire year. Quote, "The beams it shed were not clear, nor such as it is accustomed to shed." And he associated the event with war, pestilence, and, quote, "all other things leading to death." Now, Cassiodorus, who was a Roman official serving Theodoric the Great in Italy, says, quote, "all of us are still observing, as it were, a blue-colored sun." He claims it had been going on for over a year, and that it had caused, again a quote, "a winter without storms, spring without mildness, summer without heat." And he talks about major crop failures. Now, the interesting thing is that it seems to have had global effects. So we have sources in Mesopotamia that talk about unseasonably heavy falls of snow and distress amongst men. In China, in the document the Nanxi, it talks about drought and famine and about yellow dust raining down like snow. In Korea, massive storms, flooding, followed by drought. And proxy data, scientific data, also tells us that something happened. Dendrochronology, which is the study of tree rings, tells us that from 536, for about 5 to 15 years, there are very narrow rings in series from a number of different tree species, sampled from across Europe and elsewhere in the Northern Hemisphere, including the Americas. So the standard hypothesis is that it's due to dust or ash thrown into the area after some sort of cataclysmic event, hence the dust veil. Now, there are sulfate deposits in ice cores that are suggestive of a volcanic eruption to some scholars. We see similar evidence after the eruption of Mount Tambora in 1816. And I bring up Mount Tambora because it triggers what's known as the year without a summer, which is a year when we had massive crop failures and cooling of the Earth's average temperature along the lines of zero point 0.4 to zero point 0.7 degrees Celsius. That's a lot in terms of the Earth's average temperature. People from the time described it as a dry fog that turned the sunlight red and dimmed it. So, what happened in 536? There was some type of upheaval in Eurasia, possibly globally. Might have been a volcanic eruption. Scholars have pointed to a few different potential culprits, including Rabaul in Papua New Guinea or even possibly Krakatoa. Researchers from the UK have a new culprit and a volcano in Iceland. They didn't specify which last time I read about their research, but we can presume they'll be publishing on it at some point. Another potential option is a comet or an asteroid impact. I mean, if all of these climactic changes happened in this short period, something more than a minor volcanic event had to be involved. Interesting note, this whole issue was more or less ignored by historians for quite some time. But lately, the dust veil has been depicted as the worst climate disaster in recorded history, basically the hinge of the Dark Ages. The problem is that some historians have tried to link too much to this, whatever it was. The dating of archaeological material in particular cannot be that specific, and really, the decline, such as it was, of the late Roman Empire began in different places at different times. What we're seeing with the discussion of the dust veil is the attraction of a crisis point as part of a grand narrative. I mean, despite the literary accounts that we do have, they're not necessarily as clear-cut as they seem. Many chroniclers have other focal points, or they see the dust veil as a temporary bad omen. But you can kind of understand why it's attractive to think there was an environmental reason for the Dark Ages. It all plays back into the myth of progress. If you believe in it, and yet you also believe in the Dark Ages, you need to come up with a reason why the Dark Ages isn't a regression. So why not point to things beyond your control? Now, while the dust veil is fashionable recently, the traditional forces beyond our control explanation is the plague. So a little bit of introduction, first of all. The plague started in Pelusium in Egypt. That should be 541 CE, sorry. It spread throughout the province and the rest of the eastern provinces, then through Western Europe, North Africa, and possibly as far away as the British Isles. We know that it reoccurred for the next 2 centuries in waves, which is very common of the disease. Now, the plague existed, we know, in sources beforehand, but not in pandemic form. There are considered to be 3 major pandemics in history. The Justinianic plague was the first pandemic, the Black Death in the 14th century, the third pandemic originating in China at the end of the 19th century. That, by the way, is where we get the disease pool amongst ground rodents in the American Western states, rats that came over on ships from China. The third pandemic is where the plague was identified as Yersinia pestis. There's some debate as to whether it's the same plague in all cases. The symptoms do match, but they vary. There's a lot of scientific work being done on this currently. Historiographically speaking, it's generally been neglected by historians in comparison with the Black Death. Most general histories that deal with the Black Death leave out any mention of the first pandemic, or they just gloss over it, which is bizarre because it is a seismic shift in society at a very key time. Of course, the problem is that the pandemic covered too much diverse territory. There are academic and cultural divides getting in the way. I mean, if nothing else, very few scholars could read sources from all of the areas involved. There was a push in the 1980s to get multiple historical disciplines involved, art history, archaeology, numismatics. What's needed is the cooperation of sciences as well. And actually, right now, Monica Green, who is probably the greatest current medical historian of the Middle Ages is working with scientists on the Black Death, coming up with some incredible material. I kind of hope she eventually turns her attention to the first pandemic as well. All right, so what do the sources tell us about just the Justinianic plague? Well, it's discussed in a wide range of accounts: Syriac sources, Arabic sources, Greek sources. Western material is far more patchy. Um, John of Ephesus, his ecclesiastical history, is one of the primary sources. He was finishing a mission in Alexandria at the same time that the plague arrived, and he sort of traveled with it back to Constantinople. He saw whole towns wiped out, harvests abandoned, corpses lying unburied. Um, I'll read you a couple of quotes from him. We used to think that if there would be evening, death would come upon us suddenly in the night. Although the next morning would come, we used to face the grave during the whole day as we looked at the devastated and moaning villages in these regions and at corpses lying on the ground with no one to gather them. Crops of wheat in fertile fields located in all the regions through which we passed, from Syria up through Thrace, were white and standing, but there was no one to reap them and store the wheat. Vineyards whose picking season came and went shed their leaves since winter was severe, but kept their fruits hanging on their vines, and there was no one to pick them or press them. That's kind of scary for somebody living in an agrarian society to notice that nobody's taking in the harvest. Arabic sources are tricky because written Arabic was rare in the 6th century, and the Arabian Peninsula appears to have been lightly hit in the initial outbreaks. Early 7th century sources do tell us that they were hit more seriously by some of the later waves of the pandemic. We get these accounts from their incorporation into even later sources discussing plague epidemics, so they're a bit indirect. Do you know, it was a lot different talking about waves of the pandemic before this last year. Yeah, no medievalist is ever going to be able to teach the Justinianic plague or the Black Death quite the same way again. Now, in terms of Greek sources, first and foremost is Procopius, who we already discussed. He had the very much elite look at the impact of the plague. Now, his continuator, Agathias. Agathias was an interesting character. He was a lawyer who lived in Constantinople. And, he had a fair bit to do with the elite of society, but he also had a really good grasp of city life in Constantinople. So he's able to talk about the direct impact of the plague, as well as, the reaction of the people in the city. Now, another source worth mentioning is Evagrius Scholasticus, who was a lawyer from Antioch. He was working on his history when the plague broke out again. And he gives us some of our best examples of specific personal experiences, as well as descriptions of plague symptoms. Now, all three of our major Greek sources knew about previous epidemics, but they saw the pandemic as something new and awful. All right. So, as I said, it spread from Egypt. We think through Alexandria, which was, of course, a port city, outwards to the Mediterranean, Palestine, Jerusalem, Syria, Antioch, Constantinople. It spread to the Persians, who were hit extraordinarily hard, although our sources for them are more sketchy, and then to China by the early 7th century. The first wave was devastating but relatively slow. Word of the plague preceded its arrival in Constantinople by some time. And, think about it for a minute, guys. How long did we hear about COVID-19 before we had any kind of lockdown or real concern here? Now, for them, one of the big problems was corpse disposal. There were not enough people to bury everyone who died, and there was concern about contagion. Now, I'm not saying they understood how contagion worked, but they're not stupid people. They don't know what bacteria are, but they do know that if you spend too much time touching or around plague victims, that you're going to get sick yourself. So what happened is that the poor in Constantinople tended to be buried in common. Later in the outbreak, they were loaded onto ships and cast off. Justinian had to order stretchers made to carry bodies and hire people to dig graves. He apparently paid in gold to motivate them. It was a way for healthy people to make a very good living. They had large pits that could hold up to 70,000 dead. We think there were maybe, thousands of people dying in Constantinople every day. You need to understand that Constantinople, in the 5th century, we think may have had as many as 500,000 people. So this is a very big city. And a very big city by pre-modern standards that, of course, has pre-modern sanitation and intensive crowding. So the consequences were inevitable. I'll read you a quote from John of Ephesus. Men and women were trodden down, and in the space between them, the young and infants were pressed down, trodden with the feet, and trampled down like spoiled grapes. The people who write these things, they're in traumatic shock, basically. They're seeing people being crammed into plague burial pits. This is the sort of thing that's left us, sort of testimony as to what they saw. There are records of hallucinations. People apparently in Constantinople kept imagining that they saw boats of brass with headless people in them, and were told that nobody in any of the big cities left home without a written tag containing their name and their district, in fact, in case they died during the course of the day and the family needed to find them. Now, demographically speaking, the crisis was in labor. It becomes a seller's market. The consequences in economic depression and inflation, and in the cities, starvation due to untended herbs and crops. Justinian attempted an edict regulating skilled labor, wages and prices. This type of thing does not work, not even in a pre-modern economy. We see European kings try the same thing after the Black Death. It doesn't work then either. It killed possibly half the population of Constantinople, and some historians suggest a 50 to 60% mortality rate in total in the empire between 541 and the end of the 7th century. Certainly trade is crippled. It's, long distance trade is just not a thing that's going to be happening while this is going on. It puts the empire on shaky financial footing. If you lose that many taxpayers, what happens to your revenue? How do you pay your soldiers? Well, you don't pay your soldiers. It has an impact on their ability to respond to the challenges in Italy, for instance. Justinian does manage to stave off financial and military collapse, but only because the empire had been in such good shape ahead of time. 10 years later, they'd recovered enough to begin recouping some of their losses. But at the same time, you see the rise of Islam and a whole new set of challenges. Now, there's a general contraction of wealth, a disruption in the rural labor force, but also changes in religion. So there's an increasing focus on religious responses to this type of crisis. The church becomes involved with hiring doctors to help with the sick, but also with rituals to avert God's wrath. I mean, what do you think? If you're living in a religious society and suddenly everybody around you is dying, if you're a religious person, of course you're going to think, what have we done to make God angry? I would say, probably the really significant thing here is the reduction in trade. It really begins to remake the social and economic face of the Mediterranean world. I mean, these underlying structures that weren't affected too much by the change of management in the old Roman West are now going to be affected much more significantly. I mean, this is a process, right? It's not something that happens overnight. We can talk about the end of the ancient world as we know it, but it doesn't happen in the same place in the same way. So, an end to the ancient world is arbitrary. It's also dependent on what region you're talking about. So, late antiquity, which is what we're going to talk about in our final lecture, is a valuable concept, at least for Eurasia, because it focuses on cultural continuity as well as discontinuity. And it avoids the stigma of 476, the fall of the Roman Empire. And we'll talk more about that. And of course, though, what about the rest of the world? I mean, this is only Western Eurasia. So what this tells us is that there are serious limitations to the tripartite scheme of history. The whole ancient, medieval, modern thing doesn't work when you go too far outside of Europe. It simply does not. Okay, that's the end of that lecture. I'll be back shortly with the next.